Thank you, Roland. Good morning, everybody. Welcome, whether this is your 100th time or first time to the Humanist Society. A couple of weeks ago, I attended a rally down at the Supreme Court that was organized by a coalition of groups trying to get money out of politics, the impossible task. But the speakers were criticizing the corporate takeover of democracy, and the crowd was angry about how our precious system of majority rule is being auctioned off to the highest bidder. We have voter repression in all forms, we have business manipulation of congressmen, we have the use of the free speech arguments to give corporations control of our elections, and this threatens our republic. At this October 8th rally, the last chapter, this latest chapter of this sorry story was being written inside the Supreme Court chamber. Sean McCutcheon was suing over his right to give as much money as he wants to individual candidates. This is the case McCutcheon versus the Federal Election Commission. He was challenging the constitutional fair, simple limits on aggregate contributions. The bloated political action committees were not enough for him. This CEO of the Colmont Electric Development Company asked a surprisingly effective and simple question. He said, "Why am I not free to spend as much money as I want?" Well, had he been at the rally, he would have gotten some answers. They were shouted in the speeches, they were sung out in song, they were emblazoned on t-shirts and on signs. We'll start with one that had simple numbers. A placard read, "Donation limit, $123,000. Average income, $28,000. Do the math. One t-shirt said, money isn't speech, corporations aren't people. Another sign demanded separation of wealth and state. I like that one. Mr. McCutcheon could also learn some reasons why he can't give all the money he wants if he read a little bit of history and how such things, for example, the Gilded Age corporations in the late 1800s ran roughshod over our legislature. They were demanding things like tariffs to protect the corporations and raise prices, land grants for the railroads to use, labor laws that treated workers as slaves. And history teaches that that sort of rough behavior is not going to do well for our democracy. It needs care, it needs respect. Back in 1787, supposedly Ben Franklin, when he was leaving the Constitutional Convention, was asked by somebody on the street, "Doctor, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" And he answered, "A republic, if you can keep it." And that is a real question today. Can we keep our democratic republic, or will the courts continue to side not with the many, but with the money? Now, we're going to have to wait months for the ruling in the McCutcheon case to come out. So in the meantime, I think we need to raise our voices. We have to demand the best from our leaders. We have to make sure that our system serves all of us, not just those beholden to those with deep pockets. Now, most corruption is not about bad people. That I want to make clear. Lawrence Lessig, the author of Republic Lost, explains it this way. He says, "There are no vampires or dragons here." Most incoming legislators don't want to spend 30, 40, or 50, 70% of their time raising money. They don't want to be forced to lean to the green, as all the consultants say that they have to do. Lessig points out that from 1974 to 2008, the average cost of a congressional campaign went from $56,000 to $1.3 million. Consultants teach politicians to be not red, not blue, but green. Because most big donors give to both sides of the campaign, so whoever wins, they have them in their pockets. They want the winner to pledge allegiance to the corporation, not to their better judgment. This is how Governor Ed Rendell explained it. He said, "There's so many legislators who have said to me, 'Gosh, if I could vote in secret, I could vote for your proposal, Governor, because I know it's the right thing to do. But I can't do it. The other side will raise money and kill me.'" Rendell continues, "It's so important to get the influence out of money in politics. Because if you get the influence of money out of politics, we will get people who actually vote their conscience." What a concept. So here's what I'm going to speak about today. basically four things. First, the sacredness of suffrage. A sacredness that's enshrined in the historic sacrifice of brave martyrs who have died to protect the vote and preserve democracy. Second, the ever-present, evolving power of money. Third, the role of the Supreme Court in facilitating this tragic demise. And I'll conclude with arguing that it's our duty to vote and to protect democracy by supporting perhaps a constitutional amendment to get money out of politics. So, the sacredness of suffrage. When de Tocqueville came to the United States early in the 1800s, survival of our democratic experiment was still in question. But the French visitor saw a lot of reasons to be optimistic, most notably the citizens' enthusiasm for the democratic process. He called us a new breed of political animal that celebrated election days like civic festivals. He said we took pride in the electoral process. De Tocqueville saw in America what he saw in no other place in the world, a sense that the worth of the individual was dependent on their role as citizen and voter. They expressed an attitude described by Edmund Burke when he said that the state ought to be looked on with reverence. He said, it is a partnership in all science, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue, and in all perfection. Now, the person who thought up ethical societies, Felix Adler, appreciated how this partnership in his new American home was so different when he compared it to the Europe that he fled. The sparks of democracy had been flickering in Europe for decades, well into the mid-18th century. But Europe was not ready for democracy, and there were vicious, repressive counter-revolutions that crushed democratic flames and sent many liberals fleeing from Europe, including Adler's family, who left for safer shores. So when Adler arrived in the United States as a boy, he found the public participation in civic affairs exciting and liberating here, both protecting individual rights, at the same time caring about the collective. This century-old democracy was fulfilling what Adler calls the spiritual end of citizenship. Individual voters sustained the collective good. E pluribus unum. Out of many, one. That phrase and that reality was important to Adler. The franchise is fundamental to our personal, civic, and ethical growth. Now, George Odell, who was a volunteer for many years in the first half of the last century, put it this way. I love this. He says, democracy is something more than the pulling of a lever in a voting booth. It means the appeal to think in social terms, to belong consciously in a community, to share intelligence with each other, to do one's work in the world so as to enhance the working power and achievement of others, to recognize that class barriers and economic distinctions are an insult to the human soul, that in all persons there is the possibility of decency. But that decency can't be accessed in this country if you're disenfranchised. Now, down at the Supreme Court, I heard a Reverend Barber speak about what was important to him in his work in North Carolina. And he was pointing out the obvious phrase. Afterwards, I thanked him for doing that, because right above the Supreme Court, what is written? What is etched in huge words? Does anybody know?
Yes. Equal justice.
Equal justice under law. Equal justice under law. This basic principle is being challenged. Moneyed interests are sullying this important process of democracy. Reverend Barber said that the ballot box is a sacred place. He talked about how the sacredness was sanctified by the sweat and sacrifice of the civil rights movement. He talked about President Johnson, who appreciated the ethical context of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. When he was urging Congress to pass it, this is what Johnson said. He said, I speak to you tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. I urge every member of both parties, Americans of all religions, of all colors, from every section of the country to join me in that cause. So, the sacrifice, the dignity of humans, and the destiny of democracy. All Americans should know the sacrifice that was given to the vote, and many don't. I wondered, would it make Americans better appreciate the ballot if they heard the stories of Lucy Stone or Wendell Phillips, Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Inez Mulholland? They could go on and on and on. Would they appreciate the votes more if they understood what was said at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848? At that historic gathering, women declared that men, quote, never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise, and that men conspired to destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life. In fact, men treated women as if they were civilly dead. That's what taking the vote away does. The Declaration of Rights and Sentiments at Seneca Falls concluded with these words: "Now, in view of this entire disenfranchisement of one half of the people of this country, their social and religious degradation, in view of the unjust laws above mentioned, and because women do feel themselves aggrieved, oppressed, and fraudulently deprived of the most sacred rights, we insist that they have immediate admissions to all rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of the United States." Their very integrity that was challenged in so many ways required the ballot, and they were willing to die for the cause. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in supporting that declaration, pointed to a historic martyr for inspiration. She said, "Voices were the visitors and advisors of Joan of Arc. Do not voices come to us daily from the haunts of poverty, sorrow, degradation, and despair, already too long unheeded? Now is the time for women of this country, if they would save our free institutions, to defend the right to buckle on the armor that can best resist the keenest of weapons of the enemy, contempt and ridicule. The same religious enthusiasm that nerved Joan of Arc to her work nerves us to ours." Now, such imagery also recalled another martyr, Inez Milholland, I mentioned. She was an activist for women's suffrage in Europe and the United States, and she was famous for riding a horse in suffrage parades in Washington and New York. And she became known as the Herald and was adopted by the British suffragist movement as their patron saint. She was increasingly compared to Joan of Arc, and she sealed that comparison because she worked so hard and long. She collapsed in 1916 in Los Angeles, and supposedly her dying words were addressed to Woodrow Wilson, who did not support women's suffrage at the time. She said, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" Her memorial service was the first memorial service in the U.S. Capitol for a woman. Activist Maud Younger eulogized her there with symbolism. She said, "She was the flaming torch that went ahead to light the way, the symbol of light and freedom." The National Women's Party took as their logo Mulholland atop a horse with a flowing robe, and the motto was "Forward into Light." But there was so much darkness still. Just the next year, suffragettes protesting at the White House were seized by policemen, thrown into prison in an old abandoned Virginia workhouse. They went on a hunger strike and they were force-fed. This was the Occoquan incident. Look it up. It's stunning. One night, dozens of guards attacked the women, and according to affidavits, they were grabbed, dragged, beaten, choked, slammed, pinched, twisted, and kicked. This horror so embarrassed one Virginian, Woodrow Wilson, that he changed his mind about women's suffrage, and eventually there was a little bit of light when the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920. But it came with sacrifice. Obviously, 50 years earlier, the 15th Amendment gave right to ex-slaves, but it took over a century due to the trickery and threats that kept them in the dark. In 1957, Martin Luther King gave a speech in Washington entitled, "Give Me the Ballot," 100 years after the amendment. He also evokes this metaphor of light in recalling the May 17, 1954 Brown versus Board Supreme Court decision. And these are King's words. "For all men of goodwill, this May 17th decision came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of human captivity. It came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of disinherited people throughout the world who had dared to dream of freedom. Unfortunately, all types of conniving methods are still being used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. The denial of the sacred right is a tragic betrayal of the highest mandates of our democratic tradition. And so our most urgent request to the President of the United States and to every member of Congress is to give us the vote. Give us the ballot, and we will no longer have to worry the federal government about our basic rights. Give us the ballot, and we will no longer plead to the federal government for passage of an anti-lynching law. We will, by the power of our voice, write the law on the statute books of the South and bring an end to the dastardly acts of hooded perpetrators of violence. Give us the ballot, and we will transform the salient misdeeds of bloodthirsty mobs into calculated good deeds of orderly citizens. Give us the ballot, and we will place judges on the benches of the South who will do justly and love mercy. Give us the ballot, and we will quietly and non-violently, without rancor or bitterness, implement the Supreme Court's decision of May 17, 1954. God, I wish I could write like that. Many braver than me gave their life for those words. The list is incredible. It includes the Reverend George Lee, who was one of the first blacks registered to vote in Humphrey County, Mississippi, who was murdered May 7, 1955, the year after Brown. It includes Lamar Smith, who organized voters and then was shot on a Mississippi courthouse lawn in broad daylight in front of dozens of witnesses, and no one was brought to justice. It includes Herbert Lee, who helped register black voters in 1961 and was killed by a state legislator claiming self-defense, who went free. It includes Jonathan Daniels, an Episcopal Seminary student from Boston, who registered voters in Lowndes County. If you know Lowndes County, that's not a place you go without fear. And he was shot to death by a deputy sheriff. It includes James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, Michael Shermer, who were murdered and buried in an earthen dam near Philadelphia, Mississippi. And despite all of that violence, people kept coming and coming and coming, including C.T. Vivian, who walked up the stairs of the Selma County Courthouse, telling Jim Clark, the sheriff, that he wanted to register to vote. A policeman came up to him and began to push him away, saying, "Stop acting for the cameras," because there were cameras there filming it. And Vivian replied, "It's not a matter of being in front of the cameras. It's a matter of facing your sheriff and facing your judge. We're being beaten for democracy, and you're misusing democracy. You beat people bloody in order that they will not have the privilege to vote. You beat me in the side of my head, and you hide your blows. We have come to register to vote." Now, injustice came in many less violent forms, like selective implementation of poll taxes or literacy tests. Lawrence Guyot, who knew of such matters, spoke both on the TV series Eyes on the Prize and in my history classroom in which his son sat. And he spoke about registering to vote. And what he was given was a 22-page questionnaire. One of the questions said, interpret any of the 206 sections of the Mississippi Constitution to the satisfaction of the registrar. Even though many of the registrars couldn't read or write themselves. It didn't matter. They could still determine who was going to vote. All whites who registered got approved. Similar tricks were used against the Latino vote, something that Willie Velazquez couldn't take in the 1970s. He took over and over again through his voter registration drives. He generated 85 court cases in Southern California. He won every single case. That's how blatant the voter discrimination was, even in the 1970s. And it goes on and on and on up to today, with methods of control and corruption that adapt to the times. So instead of nooses and poll taxes and literary tests or unequal voting place access, the best tool for manipulation today is simply money. It's money that controls who gets into office, who gets political favors. And that's how the system is set up. It's a rigged game. Jamie Raskin, who's a friend of mine and a progressive state senator in Maryland, spoke of it this way. He talked about the fact that people who get into Congress and listen to people in businesses are listening to people who are legally obligated to maximize profits. Okay? So, the billions of dollars, this is Jamie's words, the billions of dollars turned loose for campaign purposes at the direction of corporate managers not only can, but under terms of corporate law, must be spent to increase profits. He continues, if businesses choose to exercise their newly minted political money speech, they must work to install officials who will act as corporate tools. That's what's behind the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, the central villain of the video that we're going to show in this room at 1:30 today. The 40-year-old ALEC describes itself as a nonpartisan public-private partnership, and it enjoys tax-free status as an educational nonprofit. Now, according to Bill Murray, I won't spill too much of the video, but ALEC has members from hundreds of corporations like Coca-Cola, ExxonMobil, Pfizer, Koch Industries, many law firms, many lobbyists, and 1,000 state legislators. Ronald Reagan called ALEC a, quote, partnership that offers businessmen the extraordinary opportunity to apply their talents to solve our nation's problems. Baloney. It's just a way to get government favor for their corporation. ALEC holds educational conferences in which corporate interests create template bills that lawmakers are given and encouraged to submit to their legislatures. These 850 bills look at issues from environment to labor to consumer protection through the lens of higher profits, not the common good. ALEC's effective mostly because they focus on the state level where money goes a lot further. The Center for Media and Democracy claims that ALEC has gotten 85 bills signed across the nation. And Moyers points out that some states, like Arizona's, are almost subsidiaries of ALEC, where 49 out of 90 Arizona state legislators are members of ALEC. So ALEC's now being supported by this pro-business Supreme Court, and today's stance in Money versus Politics began in 1971, do a little bit of court history, with the Federal Election Campaign Act, tried to rein in political influence. But in 1976, the court struck down parts of it in Buckley versus Vallejo, in which they ruled that cash is a constitutionally protected version of free speech. In 2002, the Federal Election Campaign Act was strengthened by McCain-Feingold that prohibited advocacy ads within 60 days of general election and required national political party committees to obey federal limits on raising and spending money. And the court let that stand for a while. In McConnell versus the FCC, the majority said, "We are under no illusions that the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act will be the last congressional statement on the matter." This is a court words now. I love this one. "Money, like water, will always find an outlet." A Taoist lesson. This outlet has come in the form of free speech arguments. Judge Thomas called the McConnell decision, arguing against it, quote, "the most significant abridgments of freedom of speech since the Civil War." Now that kind of hyperbole infected the Citizens United decision in 2010. The court declared that corporations and unions should be considered legally persons having constitutionally protected free speech. They can spend as much as they want on advertising, supporting, or attacking candidates. The related 2010 ruling in SpeechNow.org versus the FEC allowed nonprofits to avoid PAC regulation on reporting and to accept individual contributions of $5,000. Now, I appreciate the court wanting to defend free speech, but do they have to do it in a way that only increases corporate control of campaigns? Retired Supreme Court Justice Stevens, I think, says what I would say. He says, while American democracy is imperfect, few outside the majority of this court would have thought its flaws included a dearth of corporate money in politics. That's not what we're aching for. That was the consensus in 2011 at the American Ethical Union Assembly in Columbus, Ohio, when passed a resolution condemning Citizens United, allowing money, quote, moneyed special interest groups to manipulate public policy with devastating effects. The resolution encouraged state legislation, this is an interesting technique, requiring that for-profit corporations and unions must get prior approval of their shareholders or members before spending money on a campaign. I actually think that's an ingenious idea. I doubt it's going to happen. Because money talks, and regulations protecting our democracy get demolished. Just recently, the 1965 Voting Rights Act had the Section 4 provisions dismantled, virtually making it unenforceable. This was the act that required states with a history of racial discrimination to get prior approval before changing their voting regulations. And almost instantly, restrictions on voting started to pop up in state after state across the South. The franchise is being attacked. So, let me talk a little bit more about the vote. Article 21 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights states, everyone has a right to take part in the government through universal and equal suffrage. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt, when she was drawing up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, she knew that the right to vote was not guaranteed in the U.S. Constitution. Not everybody knows that. I mean, sure, you could draw some implied element of that because there are various amendments that extended the vote to ex-slaves, to women, and to people between the age of 18 and 21. But there's no guarantee to the right to vote. Should it be? Should we have an amendment that says that? Would it hold back this tide of restrictions on this basic right? Would it stop voter ID laws, for example? There was a little bit of sanity recently in some of the courts, state courts, striking those down. But back in 2008, the Supreme Court held up Indiana's picture ID law in Crawford versus Marion County. And while showing IDs at polling places seems like not a big deal, estimates are that 11 to 12% of voting age population do not have a required ID. People argue that this ID would stop voter fraud. Voter fraud is hardly ever cited in the United States. It just doesn't happen much here. But voter restriction does. That's not rare. Restrictions on registration happens all the time. To the ludicrous extent that the League of Women Voters, an organization that has been working to increase civic participation since 1920, basically pulled out of Florida because new laws down there said that registration had to be first. You had to get state permission to register. And then if you didn't turn in your registration form within 48 hours, you faced fines. These are just a few of the things that the state was lobbying at the League of Women Voters to stop. Formerly incarcerated people have the vote denied them all the time, even though it's not something that should be right. Down in Virginia, for the last year, 2% of previously incarcerated individuals got their vote back. Amazingly, the Republican governor and attorney general now are actually supporting the vote for felons. I think they want to get it off the table as a potential campaign issue. But that's progress. The vote is an important civic responsibility, and it's a transformational thing. When people get the vote and they care about their civic life, I think it can change people for the better. Why limit political inclusion? People have struggled hard enough for it. When I was doing research, a cousin of mine told me that one of my ancestors was the first woman on record to vote in the U.S. colonies. That's kind of cool. Lydia Chapin Taft voted in a 1756 town meeting in the Massachusetts colony town of Uxbridge, Massachusetts. So I think, yeah, and I voted in every election of my life. If you voted in every election that you could, give yourself a gold star. Most people don't. Susan Jacoby, who's an atheist and secular activist, argues that it's our civic duty to vote. In good economic times or bad, whether you like the candidate or not, whether you've had disagreements with the candidate or not, whether you're feeling optimistic about the future or not, whether you have a bad cold on election day or not. She bemoans the fact that voters don't vote because they don't feel enthusiasm for the candidates. But it's our democracy. People talk about Washington as if it's some sort of foreign occupying power that has invaded our country. We put the people there. President Johnson spoke of this basic need to reclaim our dignity through the vote, not excuse apathy. We should expand, not restrict, access to the vote. Glenn Smith wrote a book, Voting Rights, Democracy, and the Dignity of Man, and he put it this way. He said, if we want to continue to gloat about being the world's greatest democracy, we should expand early voting. Election day itself should be made a holiday. We should streamline registration efforts and allow for same-day registration. We should have real, universal voting standards that apply to all citizens, no matter where they live. Well, with too little time and too much to say, I'm just going to urge a couple of things. I'm still learning about this, so I'll start with this advice. Continue to learn with me. Let's educate ourselves more. You can start by watching the Moyers video this afternoon about ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. I've seen it twice. Second, get involved person to person with people in organizations that are defending democracy. Speak to Ted Ullman at Move to Amend. How many people know Move to Amend? Get to know them. They're advocating a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, which I think actually is going to be a tougher sell. I like some of the other strategies a little bit more. Talk to Phyllis Beck at Common Cause or Steve Masters at Public Citizen. The Penn Public Interest Group, look into them. Look into Wolfpack. Wolfpack is arguing for an Article 5 a constitutional convention of states that will wrestle back control of the federal government. Even the threat of an Article 5 convention might make a change. Speak to Alex Shepard with Root Strikers and talk to him about the work of Lawrence Lessig that inspires him from Harvard. Third, join the call for public financing of elections. This is an approach that's supported by Lessig. He has a plan, he calls it the Grant and Franklin plan, meaning $50 and $100 bills. This is the oversimplified short version. Basically, you would be able to take $50 from your taxes as a voucher, a democracy voucher, and give it to your candidate or party of choice. And you could give $100 of your own money in addition to that. If everybody in this country did that, $3 billion would be generated for the elections. That's about how much we spend now, except rather than it coming from 0.4% of the country, it would come from everybody. And it would limit the special access that the very wealthy get. Consider walking the walk. There are flyers outside about a November 2nd event organized by a group called March Against Corruption that's raising awareness and asking for a return to ethics in government. And they argue that it's not a partisan issue, it's not right against left, it's about right versus wrong. Register to vote yourself and encourage others to. That's my biggest piece of advice. I mean, it's no wonder that money influences our campaigns when well less than 50% of the population votes in most elections. Franklin Delano Roosevelt got it half right when he said, "Nobody will ever deprive the American people of the right to vote except the American people themselves. And the only way they can do this is by not voting." Voting should be respected as a sacred civic act. And if we don't treat it that way, democracy, I think, is threatened. If we forget the struggle and sacrifice that earned us the vote, from our revolution against a monarch, to the courage of the suffragettes, to the blood shed by the vet registration workers in the Civil Rights South, maybe we deserve a government of the funders, by the funders, and for the funders. We need a mass movement demanding a true democracy that respects people more than profits, ballots more than bucks. The power is in our hand. My favorite t-shirt down in the Supreme Court read, "If the 99% vote, the 1% don't matter." We have to refuse to allow our government to be sold to the highest bidder. Big business wants us to remain passive, apathetic, moaning about how we can't change the system. Let's prove them wrong, and let's change the system. Thanks a lot.